Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time we are traveling back in time to 1964
Oh, very cool.
to take a look at an issue of Woman magazine.
Okay.
Now, we are going to be analyzing this through a media studies lens, as always.
Good.
So whether you are listening to this because you are studying media studies, you're prepping for your A-levels, or maybe you were just fascinated by this era,
Right.
we are going to be uncovering some really interesting stuff today, hopefully.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing what you can find when you really start to look closely at these old magazines.
True.
They might seem like just, light entertainment, but they're actually packed with clues about the society they came from.
Yeah, like little time capsules.
Exactly.
So before we jump into the pages, let's just think about the magazine itself. Woman magazine.
Okay.
What kind of publication was this back in 1964?
Well, it was a weekly magazine aimed at, women, obviously.
Right.
And it was incredibly popular. Millions of women would have read it every week. And it covered a whole range of topics from fashion and beauty to cooking and homemaking to current events and celebrity gossip.
I see. So kind of like a one-stop shop for the modern woman of the time.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it.
So let's dive in now and start with that all-important first impression.
Okay.
The cover.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at here?
Well, first of all, we've got this lovely image of a woman. She's dressed in a pretty floral dress. She's got this kind of like soft smile. She looks very approachable.
Very friendly.
Yeah, very friendly, very relatable.
Okay.
Then you've got the masthead, the world's greatest weekly for women.
Bold statement.
It is, isn't it?
Mm,
And it's in this big, bold font that really stands out.
it does, yeah.
And I think it's interesting how they've positioned themselves as the greatest.
Yeah, why would they do that?
Well, I think it's a way of establishing their authority.
I see.
They're saying, we're the experts on all things womanly. Trust us.
And do you think women back then were looking for that kind of guidance from a magazine?
I think so, yeah. Especially in a time when, women's roles were changing so rapidly.
Yeah,
There was a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, I think.
it makes sense.
And a magazine like this could offer a sense of, reassurance and belonging.
It's like they're saying, we understand you. We're here for you.
Exactly.
And then there's the price, too. 7 pence.
That's right. Yeah, that would have been pretty affordable.
Yeah, even for women who maybe didn't have a lot of disposable income.
Right. And I think that's another important point to consider. The magazine was trying to appeal to a broad audience.
So they had to make it accessible.
Exactly.
Okay, and then, of course, we can't ignore the big name on the cover, Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense himself.
Yeah. It's a pretty surprising choice, isn't it?
It is. I mean, he's not exactly known for his romantic comedies.
No, not really. But I think it's a very clever marketing tactic.
How so?
Well, Hitchcock was a huge celebrity back then. Everyone knew his name.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And he had this kind of aura of sophistication and intelligence. So by having him on the cover, they're lending the magazine some of that prestige.
They're elevating it.
Exactly.
And he's not just there, just for his name. He's actually quoted as saying, British women have a special magic.
Oh, yeah. That's a brilliant bit of flattery.
Isn't it?
It's like he's saying, you readers, you're special, you're magical.
Giving them permission to enjoy this magazine.
Right, exactly. And I think it would have worked.
I bet.
Women would have felt seen and appreciated.
And then alongside this sort of, endorsement from Hitchcock, we've got cover lines promising things like 7-star improvements for your kitchen and lively lingerie.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix, isn't it?
It is. On the one hand, you've got this emphasis on domesticity, improving your home.
The traditional role of a woman.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But then you've also got this hint of something a bit more,
Risque.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think that reflects the changing times,
How so?
Well, women were still expected to be good wives and mothers, but there was also this growing sense of liberation. Women were starting to explore their sexuality more, and the magazine is reflecting that.
So it's kind of walking this tightrope between tradition and modernity,
Exactly.
trying to appeal to both sides.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've got this very intriguing cover promising all sorts of things. Now, let's flip the page and see what's inside. And wow, this contents page is like a visual feast. It's so colorful and vibrant.
It is, isn't it? Very 1960s.
Yeah, getting like American diner vibes from those blue shapes.
Me too.
Very retro chic.
And then right in the middle of it all, we've got Jackie Kennedy,
Oh, yeah.
and it says The Long Road Back to Happiness.
Wow, so this is just a year after President Kennedy's assassination.
That's right.
So her image would have carried a lot of weight at this time,
Oh, absolutely. She was a global icon.
and the epitome of grace and style.
Right, even in the face of tragedy.
So what do you think the magazine is trying to do by featuring her so prominently?
Well, I think it's a way of connecting with the readers on an emotional level. You know, a lot of women would have empathized with Jackie's loss.
Especially after the World Wars, yeah.
Exactly.
So it's creating this sense of shared experience.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way of reinforcing the magazine's message of hope and resilience.
Like, if Jackie can find happiness again, so can you.
Right.
Very clever.
And then if you look at the subheadings on the contents page, you've got things like no excuses, film show, sized up.
It's almost like a roadmap for how to be a modern woman.
It is, isn't it?
It's very prescriptive.
Yeah, they're laying out what women should be interested in and how they should be behaving.
Like a guidebook.
Exactly.
And is this something we see a lot of in women's magazines of this era?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It was very common.
Wow. So even something as simple as a contents page can reveal so much about the social context.
Right. It's not just a list of articles. It's a reflection of the era's expectations for women.
Amazing. Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of the magazine's overall tone and message now. But before we move on, did you notice anything else about the contents page that stood out to you?
Well, one thing that struck me was that the editor of Woman magazine was a woman.
Oh, yeah.
Which is pretty significant, I think.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, because in 1964, most media outlets were still dominated by men.
Right.
So having a female editor would have been quite unusual.
It makes you wonder if that had any impact on the magazine's content.
I'm sure it did, yeah. You know, a female editor would have brought a different perspective to the table.
And maybe a deeper understanding of the target audience.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's keep that in mind as we delve further into the magazine, because now I want to take a look at the A-Level Beauty article.
Okay.
Which I find really fascinating because it's presented in this very structured grid format.
It is, yeah. Very organized and methodical.
With a scoring system.
Right.
So you tick off the beauty techniques you use, and then you tally up your points to see where you rank.
Kind of like a quiz.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fun, isn't it?
It is. It's very engaging.
And I think that's part of the appeal.
But it's also subtly reinforcing these very specific beauty standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all about conforming to a particular ideal.
Right. And it's interesting how they've used this kind of like scientific language.
Good-level beauty.
Exactly. It makes it sound very authoritative, very objective.
Like there's a right way and a wrong way to be beautiful.
Yeah. And if you don't score highly enough, then you've failed somehow.
Put a lot of pressure.
It is, isn't it?
And then right next to this article, we've got an advert for Max Factor Creme Puff.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
It is. And the image in the advert shows a woman in a very stylish office setting.
Right. She's surrounded by men.
And she's looking very confident and composed.
Yeah, very much in control.
So what do you make of this juxtaposition? You know, on the one hand, we've got this article telling women how to be beautiful.
And on the other hand, we've got this image of a woman succeeding in a male-dominated workplace. Well, I think it's a reflection of the changing roles of women.
In what way?
Well, more and more women were entering the workforce in the 1960s.
Right.
So the magazine is acknowledging that.
But they're also still emphasizing the importance of beauty.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Even in a professional setting.
It's like they're saying you can have a career, but you still need to look flawless.
So even as women were gaining more opportunities.
The pressure to conform to certain beauty standards remained.
It's a complex picture, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It highlights the challenges women faced in 1964.
They were navigating new opportunities, but they were still grappling with these very traditional expectations.
Exactly.
And all of this just in the first few pages.
I know, right?
It's amazing how much we can learn from just a quick glance at a magazine.
It is.
Before we move on, though, I want to point out one small detail that I think is quite significant.
Okay.
The font that they've used for the title Woman on the cover.
Yes.
They've used that same font throughout the entire magazine.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
For all the headlines and subheadings.
That's a good spot.
So it's like a visual branding element.
It is, yeah. It creates a sense of consistency.
And it instantly connects the reader to the magazine's identity.
Right. You see that font and you know exactly what you're looking at.
It's Woman Magazine.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp of the magazine's overall style and tone now. But next, I want to delve into that Hitchcock interview.
Okay, let's do it.
Because I think there's a lot to unpack there.
I agree.
So stay tuned.
Okay, so we are finally here diving into this Hitchcock interview.
Yes, and I have to say the layout is already grabbing my attention.
Oh, How so?
Well, it's not your typical celebrity interview, you
What
know.
do you mean?
It's not all glossy photos and, perfectly posed shots.
Ah, I see what you mean. Yeah. It's much more casual, isn't it?
Yeah, there's these little snapshots of Hitchcock kind of scattered throughout the text.
Right, like candid behind the scenes moments.
Exactly. And it creates this feeling like you're getting a glimpse of the real man, you know?
Like a fly on the wall.
And I think that's really smart, considering Hitchcock's persona.
Oh, in what way?
Well, he wasn't a matinee idol, was he?
No, his fame wasn't about his looks. It was his talent, his mind.
Right. So by presenting him in this more informal way,
They make him seem more relatable.
yeah, more approachable to the everyday woman reading this magazine.
Exactly. And don't forget, this is a man who is known for creating suspense and thrills.
The master of suspense.
Right? So these casual photos and the conversational tone,
It kind of softens his image a bit
yeah, it makes him seem less intimidating.
and more like someone you could sit down and have a cup of tea with.
Exactly. Which I think is perfect for this audience.
Oh, definitely. Okay, so let's talk about the content of the interview now, because Hitchcock actually opens up quite a bit about his personal life.
He does, yeah. He talks about his wife, Alma.
And he shares these little anecdotes about their marriage.
Which is interesting because Hitchcock was famously private.
He was, yeah.
So this is quite a rare glimpse into his home life.
And what's even more intriguing is what he says about his wife.
Oh, yes. Fill us in.
Well, he praises her prowess as a cook.
Okay.
And then he says, and I quote, "I'm convinced that the first sign of indifference in a woman is when her cooking suffers."
Wow.
Yeah. So what do you make of that statement?
Well, on the surface, it might seem like just a harmless observation.
Right. Like a bit of old-fashioned thinking.
But I think it actually reveals a lot about Hitchcock's views on women.
How so?
Well, he's essentially saying that a woman's primary worth is tied to her domestic abilities.
Even if she's, a talented screenwriter like Alma was.
Right, exactly. It doesn't matter how successful or intelligent a woman is.
Her true value lies in her ability to cook for her husband.
According to Hitchcock, at least.
It's quite a traditional viewpoint, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's a bit surprising coming from someone who was considered a progressive filmmaker.
You'd think he'd be a bit more forward-thinking.
You would, but I think this just goes to show how deeply ingrained these patriarchal attitudes were.
Even among the most creative minds.
Exactly. And it's not just the words that are revealing.
What else is there?
Well, look at the image sizes.
Okay.
The photo of Grace Kelly.
Yeah?
It's huge. It takes up almost half the page.
It does. Yeah, she's very prominent.
Whereas the images of Hitchcock's wife,
They're tiny.
right, and tucked away in the corners.
So what do you think that tells us?
Well, I think it reinforces this idea that a woman's worth is tied to her beauty,
Grace Kelly, the Hollywood icon, gets the star treatment.
while Alma Hitchcock, the woman behind the man,
She's relegated to the sidelines.
it's a subtle but powerful visual message.
And it makes you wonder how much has really changed in the way women are portrayed in the media.
That's a good question.
Even today, women are often judged on their appearance.
More than their accomplishments.
Exactly. It's like we're still fighting against these same old stereotypes.
It's a slow process, but hopefully we're moving in the right direction.
I hope so. Okay, so we've talked about Hitchcock. Now let's move on to something a bit lighter.
Okay.
Let's take a look at the A Present for Your Kitchen article.
Sounds good.
Because this is a prime example of how Woman Magazine uses visuals and language to promote consumerism,
Oh, absolutely.
targeted specifically at women.
So how are they doing that?
Well, first of all, the headline itself is very attention-grabbing.
A present for your kitchen.
Yeah, and it's in big, bold red letters.
It stands out.
It does.
Yeah.
And it immediately creates this sense of desire,
You need to buy something new for your kitchen.
Exactly. And then
Yeah.
you've got the images.
Oh, yeah. Those pictures are key.
They are. They're all these gleaming, modern
Elves
kitchens.
with the latest appliances.
And everything's so clean and organized.
It's the picture of domestic bliss.
Isn't it? And it reinforces this idea that a woman's happiness is tied to her home environment.
Right. Like if you have the perfect kitchen,
Then you'll be the perfect wife and mother.
it's a powerful message.
It is.
Yeah.
And they don't just show you these aspirational images.
What else do they do?
They give you specific product recommendations.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they tell you exactly what to buy.
And where to buy it.
And they even offer budgeting tips.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because remember, this is the post-war period,
Right.
a time of economic boom.
But also a time when many women were still financially dependent on their husbands,
So the magazine has to acknowledge those realities.
while still encouraging them to spend money.
It's this clever balance between aspiration and practicality.
They're saying you deserve these beautiful things.
But here's how to make it work within your budget.
Very clever.
It's a classic marketing strategy.
It is, and it speaks to the complexities of women's lives at this time.
They wanted the modern conveniences.
But they were also still bound by traditional roles and expectations.
Exactly. And speaking of traditional roles,
Yes.
did you notice the classified ads in this issue?
Oh, yes. Those were interesting.
Because on one page, you have an ad for enlistment in the Women's Royal Army Corps,
Encouraging women to join the military.
which was a very untraditional role for women at the time.
It was, yeah.
And then right next to that ad,
You have ads for household products and cooking guides.
reinforcing the more traditional roles of wife and mother.
It's such a stark contrast.
It is. And I think it highlights the conflicting messages that women were receiving.
In 1964.
They were being told they could break free from tradition.
But they were also being told to embrace their domestic duties.
It's a lot to process.
It is, and it makes you realize that progress is rarely a straight line,
It's more like a winding road.
with plenty of bumps along the way.
Very true. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But I think we're just scratching the surface of what this magazine has to offer.
I agree. There's so much more to explore.
So much more to analyze.
But for now, I think we've laid a good foundation.
We have, and in our next part, we'll delve even deeper.
Into the fascinating world of Woman Magazine.
So stay tuned. Well, we've certainly journeyed through a lot of interesting territory with Woman Magazine, haven't we?
We have. I mean, who knew that a single issue could tell us so much about life in 1964?
It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like holding a piece of history in your hands.
And I think it's a real testament to the power of media studies, you know?
Oh, boy.
Well, it helps us see these everyday objects in a whole new light.
Right, to decode the messages that are hidden in plain sight.
Exactly. And to understand how those messages might have influenced people's thoughts and behaviors.
Because it's not just about the words on the page, is it?
No, it's about the images, the layout, the overall tone and style,
It's about the whole package.
and how all of those elements work together to create a certain impression.
So, looking back at everything we've discussed, what would you say are the key takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that Woman Magazine, while it's ostensibly catering to women's interests,
It's also reinforcing traditional gender roles.
very much so.
It's presenting a very specific vision of femininity.
Right, and it's interesting how that vision is both appealing and restrictive at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. There's this emphasis on beauty and domesticity,
But there are also hints of the changing times.
like those classified ads offering a wider range of opportunities for women.
Exactly. It's that tension between tradition and progress that makes this era so fascinating.
Because women were being told they could have it all.
But the definition of all was still very much in flux.
So for our listeners out there who maybe are studying media studies or just interested in learning more about the power of media,
What advice would you give them?
what should they be paying attention to when they analyze media today?
Well, first and foremost, I would say pay attention to representation.
Who is being represented and how?
Exactly. Because those choices tell us a lot about the values and beliefs of the people who are creating the media.
And it's not just about who's included, it's also about who's excluded.
Right, and how those exclusions might be perpetuating certain stereotypes.
And then I'd also say pay attention to the language and imagery that's being used.
Because words and pictures can be very powerful tools of persuasion.
Absolutely. Think about those gleaming kitchens we saw in the Woman Magazine article.
They weren't just selling appliances, they were selling a lifestyle.
And
And they were using very specific language and imagery to evoke that ideal.
So it's important to be aware of those techniques and to think critically about the messages you're receiving.
Because media can be a powerful force for good or for bad.
It can shape our perceptions of the world and influence our decisions.
So it's crucial that we engage with it thoughtfully and critically.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a fantastic journey through time with Woman Magazine.
It has. I've learned a lot.
I have too. And I hope our listeners have as well.
I hope so too.
We've seen how even something as seemingly simple as a magazine,
Can hold a wealth of insights about society.
if you know how to look for them.
Exactly.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we hope you'll tune in again next time for another fascinating exploration of media and culture.